I already mentioned face groups briefly before, but let me reiterate that face groups provide a means of easily keeping our geometry organized for easy selection and modification. And again, the way that we can make a face group is if we press S to open the Select tool, and then click on the geometry and drag some. I'm using the left mouse button. And then press Control G. We've just created a face group. And now if we want to select all of those faces again, we can push S and then just double click on that area. Or this is also a face group, so we could double click here. And then let's suppose that we no longer want these face groups. The way that we could get rid of them is by selecting, or if we want to select all the geometry, we could instead have just pushed Control A. That selects all the faces. And then we can go to either go to Modify Clear Face Group or Shift Control G. That'll get rid of the faces. Now let's talk about a couple ways of filling holes. And so let's suppose that we've got a hole on the back here, and we want to close that up. The way we can do that is I'll push S to open the selection tool here, and then we'll just start to make a selection along the edge and double click. So we've just selected a ring. Now if we push F, that will fill in that area. And so we have different ways that we could make this fill. Right now it's doing smooth MVC, which tries to retain a smooth surface. We could change it though to flat minimal. You can see the difference. It doesn't really care so much about maintaining smoothness, or flat remeshed, which will give us consistent geometry across the surface that matches what's on the outside. Let's just choose smooth MVC in this case. Okay, we'll clear selection. Now let's suppose that we also want to close up the bottom. Another way that we can fill holes is by going to Analysis and choose Inspector. And after we click on that button, you see this blue line that pops up. That indicates that there is an opening that Meshmixer is aware of. So if we now click on Auto Repair All, that will give us some new faces on the bottom to close it up. We'll click on Done. Notice that it gave us those faces in a new face group, which is okay. We'll just keep it as is. And let's now look at the sculpting brushes. So if we click on the left-hand side, Sculpt, or another way of opening this panel is by pushing 2 on your keyboard. There are all sorts of sculpting brushes under this panel. The two that I use the most are Drag and Draw. Drag, the one that's selected right now, works relative to your point of view. Let me make the brush bigger. So again, we can make the brush bigger with the with the size slider here. You can also use the bracket keys on your keyboard, which are shown here, in order to scale it up or down. I prefer to use the keyboard shortcuts. I find it makes it a little faster. And so with the drag brush selected, let's mouse over the bunny and click and drag. And what you're going to see is it's going to move that geometry up and to the side. If I want to bring it forward and backward from the original vantage point, I have to go to this view and bring it out. So you can see this first brush, the drag brush, works relative to your point of view. Now, draw does not work relative to your point of view. It works relative to the surface of the form. And so if we click and drag now, you can see when we move across the form, it almost is like we're building clay up on the surface. So I'm just clicking down the left mouse button and dragging. And you can see it very quickly gets out of control and makes these big strands that come off. You can dial this down if you want, just by lowering the strength, if you're just trying to make smaller adjustments. And then it's much slower. It doesn't quite jut out so quickly. Now, that is the the basic way of using the brush by just clicking on the left mouse button. If we want to sort of carve down into the material, we can do that by holding down the control button and clicking on the left mouse button. And you can see how that basically is, it's like as if we're kind of scooping material out. And now let's suppose that we actually want to smooth out some of these transitions some. The way that we can do that is we hold down the Shift key and drag across. You can see how that will just ease these transitions some. That can be really useful if you've got geometry that doesn't quite blend together really well. The Shift key for smoothing helps a lot. And there are all sorts of other brushes here. I'd encourage you to just look through and try some of them out so that you get a sense of what the options are. And one thing I'll mention beyond what I just covered here, I think an additional thing that would be really helpful to know about is refinement. So refinement, if I push W on the keyboard and I zoom in, and let me make the brush, well, actually first let me just drag on the form. Do you see how it's creating additional faces as we do this? That's refinement. So if we don't want any additional faces, if we want to just keep the geometry as is, we can turn refinement off. So you can see now it's not adding anything else. The reason that this matters is that as our forms become really complex, they can become what I call heavy, which means basically that the file gets to be really large so that it could slow your computer down and eventually crash it. So you do want to be mindful that you're not packing in oodles of unnecessary geometry. So refinement gives you a way of controlling that. Another reason for being aware of refinement is that if you're trying to sculpt a form that has a particular shape you're looking to maintain, you might want to keep this off in order to preserve that original shape as much as possible.